What's up everybody, hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our channel sponsors International MTG on TCG Player, as well as Martin from the Hobby Horse. We've also started a new Discord channel which is free to join, so come hang out with us. Link in the description of this video. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you our final gameplay game that we filmed a few weeks ago back at the Hobby Horse before our friend Eli left for college. This week's game features Martin back this week playing Bristly Bill Spine Sower, Patrick returning playing Chatterfang Squirrel General, Fallgirl playing his background deck featuring Safana, Calimport, Cutthroat, and Feywild Visitor, and Eli making his season debut playing Morska Undersea Sleuth. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome a final time and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Fog plays a tapped Black Dragon Gate, choosing blue when it enters play. Eli plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn, paying 1 for an Avacyn's Pilgrim. Martin plays a Forest for turn, while Patrick plays a Swamp, paying 1 for a Ravenous Squirrel. Fog plays an Island for turn and then pays 2 for an Agent of the Shadow Thieves. Eli pays 2 life to play an untapped Hollowed Fountain before he then taps out in order to cast his commander, Morska. Martin plays a second Forest for turn, which then has him also tapping out to cast his commander, Bristly Bill. Patrick draws and plays a Forest before passing turn. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 3 to cast his commander, Safana. Eli creates a clue on his upkeep and draws for turn. He then plays an untapped Sea of Clouds before paying 3 for Benny Brack's Zoologist. This then has him going to his end step drawing a card which puts a counter onto his commander. Martin draws for turn and then casts a Pollenbright Druid which has him putting a 1/1 counter on his commander. He then goes to combat swinging Bristly Bill over at Patrick for 3 commander damage. Patrick draws for turn and plays another Forest before tapping out in order to cast his commander, Chatterfang. Fog plays a Gone Gate for turn and then pays 2 for a Mind Stone, before he then pays 3 in order to cast his background, Feywild Visitor. Fog then goes to combat swinging his commander over at Martin, which has him putting a 1/1 counter on his commander, before Martin then decides to take the commander damage and Fog creates a Fairy Dragon token. Eli creates another clue token on his upkeep and draws for turn. He then plays a Dreamroot Cascade and then pays 3 to cast Lavinia Foil to Conspiracy. He then also casts an Ongoing Investigation, which has been creating another clue token. Eli then goes to combat swinging his commander over at Fog, who just takes the 4 commander damage. He then goes to his end step drawing a card and putting another counter on his commander where Martin draws for turn. Martin then casts Ozolith the Shattered Spire before going to combat swinging his commander over at Fog this time for 3 commander damage. Patrick plays another Force for turn before paying 4 for a Creekwood Liege. He then goes to combat swinging his commander over at Martin, who just takes the 4 commander damage. Fog plays a Basilisk Gate for turn before he then pays to activate the gate, targeting his commander. He then goes to combat swinging his commander over at Eli, which puts another counter on his commander, while Eli decides to just take the 8 commander damage, and Fog creates a Fairy Dragon token. Fog then pays 3 and casts Volo Itinerant Scholar, which has him creating Volo's Journal when he enters play. Eli creates another clue token on his upkeep and draws for turn. He then casts a Junkwinder and a Pross Eidetic Memory, which has been creating a clue token and tapping down Fog's commander. He then draws a card off the enchantment entering play and puts another counter on his commander. Eli then plays a Command Towers his lane for turn. He then decides to go to combat swinging his commander over at Fog, who just chump blocks with one of his Fairy Dragon tokens. He then draws on his end step and Martin draws for turn before casting a Goldvein Hydra where X is equal to 2. Martin then swings the Hydra over at Eli, who blocks with one of his creatures, which has the Goldvein Hydra dying and Martin creating 2 tapped treasure tokens. Patrick creates a 1/1 Worm on his upkeep and then draws for turn. He then plays a tapped Overgrown Tomb and casts a Saproling Symbiosis. This then has him creating 4 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens before he once again goes to combat, swinging Chatterfang over at Martin. Fog then casts a Mistcloak Herald, which puts a counter onto his journal. He then also casts Baraka's Party Leader, putting another counter on his journal before passing turn. On his end step, Eli cracks one of his clues to draw a card, putting a counter onto his commander. This then has him tapping down Patrick's commander while he then untaps, creates a clue, and draws for turn. Eli then casts an Idol of Oblivion before tapping it in order to draw a card. This then puts another counter onto his commander and he then pays 4 to cast Wilderness Reclamation. He then goes to his end step drawing a card and untapping all of his lands before Martin then draws for turn. Martin finally gets his 3rd land, which has him putting a counter on his commander when it enters play. He then pays 3 and casts an Ornery Tumblewag, which has him putting 2 more counters on his commander. Patrick then draws for turn and then tries to end the game by casting a Triumph of the Hordes. This then gets countered by Eli with an Arcane Denial, and rightfully so, Patrick goes to combat, swinging all of his saplings over at Eli. Eli then responds by casting Swords to Plowshares to exile the Creekwood Liege before he then just takes the rest of the damage, going down to 23 life. Fog draws for turn, and then he activates Volo in order to draw 2 more cards. He then plays an Island for turn and then pays 2 for a Sigil of Valor. He then pays to equip the Sigil to Barakos before he then swings him over at Patrick. Patrick then loses 4 life while Fog creates 4 treasure tokens, and Patrick then just chump blocks Barakos with a token. Fog then casts a Grave Guild Duo, which puts another counter on his journal before passing. On his instep, Eli pays to use the clue to draw a card, putting a counter on his commander before he does it 1 more additional time. He then goes to his upkeep, untapping and creating a clue token, which has him tapping down Barakos with his creature. He then draws for turn and decides to go to combat, swinging 3 of his creatures over at Patrick, who responds by destroying his commander with an Abrupt Decay. Patrick then chump blocks 1 of the creatures and then takes the other 2 damage, before Eli then casts Vanquish the Horde in his second main phase. With no responses, the board then gets wiped of all the creatures. Eli then casts a Birds of Paradise before paying 4 for Teferi Master of Time. He then upticks Teferi to draw a card and discard a card before he then taps his idol in order to draw an additional card. Eli then untaps his lands on his instep, and Martin draws for turn before paying 3 for a Scoot Swarm. Martin then plays a Force as his land for turn, creating himself a 1/1 insect token. Patrick draws and plays a Deathcap Glade before he then pays 6 in order to cast Sendok Collector. He then passes his turn to Fog, who plays an island for turn before he then pays 1 to crack his Mind Stone, drawing an additional card. Fog then pays 5 in order to cast Safana a second time, and on his instep, Eli uses Teferi to draw a card and discard a card. He then also taps out in order to use his enchantment to exile 3 creatures from his graveyard, which has him gaining 6 life and creating 3 more clue tokens. Eli then untaps and draws for turn before uptaking Teferi in order to draw a card and discard another card. He then plays an Archway of Innovation for turn before paying 4 to cast Ethereal Investigator, which has him creating 3 clue tokens when he enters play. He then pays an additional 2 to cast Joriel Mawavi Recluse before tapping his idol, once again drawing himself another card. And in response, Fog casts Deadly Alliance, targeting Teferi, sending him to the graveyard before Eli then goes to his instep, untapping all of his lands. Martin draws for turn and then taps out in order to cast his commander a second time. Patrick plays another Force for turn before paying 2 for Gala Greeters, and then an additional 5 to recast Chatterfang a second time. Fog draws for turn and then casts Rowan's Grim Search, bargaining in his Volo's journal. This then has him looking at the top 4 cards of his library, putting 2 of them back on top while he puts 2 of them into his graveyard before he then loses 2 life and draws 2 cards. He then pays 1 to cast a multi-class Baldric before he then pays to equip it to his commander. Fog then goes to combat, swinging his commander over to Eli. Eli then pays to crack a bunch of clues and draw a bunch of cards, which has him creating multiple tokens, which he then uses to block Fog's commander. Fog's commander then goes to the graveyard and he passes his turn to Eli, who then draws for turn. Eli then swings his Investigator over at Fog, which has him dealing 2 damage and creates him another clue token. He then taps his idol to draw another card, which then triggers both of his creatures, creating a 1/1 Spirit token and a 2/2 cat. He then plays a Marsh Flats as his land for turn before he then pays 1 life to go into his library to get a land. He then puts into play a Lush Portico tapped, which has him surveilling 1 card, which he puts into his graveyard. He then pays to cast a Shimmer Dragon as well as a Forensic Gadgeteer, and in response, Patrick uses his commander's ability to sack a Squirrel tokens in order to kill Joriel. Eli then goes to his instep, untapping all of his lands while Martin draws for turn. Martin then goes to combat, swinging his commander over Patrick once again, and without any blocks being declared, he decides to cast Fertilid's Favor. This then has him going into his library to get a land to put into play, which puts 2 counters on his commander before the spell itself puts an additional 3. This then has Patrick taking 7 more commander damage, and Martin creates another insect token. Patrick then creates more squirrels on his upkeep and draws for turn. He then pays to cast an Avabrik Caretaker, making it daytime. Patrick then goes to combat, once again swinging Chatterfang over at Martin, who just takes the commander damage. Fog untaps for turn while Eli pays to crack more clues and draw more cards. Fog then draws for turn and then casts a Feywild Caretaker, which has him gaining the initiative when it enters play. He then goes into his library to get a land to put to hand, which he then plays as his land for turn. He then also casts a Treasure Dredger before going to his instep, creating himself a Fairy Dragon token. On his instep, Eli pays to crack more clues and do more shenanigans, which has him creating more spirit tokens and drawing more cards. Once he's done and he goes to his upkeep, Patrick once again responds by using Chatterfang's ability to destroy the Gadgeteer. Eli then draws for turn and plays a Deserted Beach. He then casts a turn 10 Soul Ring before paying 4 to cast Alondra Sky Dreamer. He then pays to crack a clue and draw a card, which has him creating another spirit token as well as a 2/2 Drake. Eli then goes to combat, swinging one spirit over at Fog while he swings his other flying creatures over at Patrick. This then gives Eli the initiative and he goes into his library to get a land to put into his hand while Patrick takes the rest of his damage. Second main, Eli taps some of his clues in order to cast Inspiring Statuary before he then pays to cast Tezzeret Betrayer of Flesh. He then also pays to cast a Sylvan Library as well as Lorn of the Third Path, which uses to blow up Martin's Ozolith. Finally, Eli upticks Tezzeret to draw 2 cards before going to his instep, untapping all of his lands while Martin draws for turn. Martin then pays to cast a Chomping Kavu, which has him putting a counter onto his commander. He then also casts a Serpent Blade Assailant, which puts another counter onto his commander. After this, Martin then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Eli. In response to this, Eli does a bunch of shenanigans, which involves him cracking a bunch of clues and drawing a bunch of cards in order to create another Drake, before he then draws enough cards to trigger a lot in order to pump his Drakes up enough to double block Martin's commander. Bristly, Bill, and the Drake then trades, and Martin passes his turn to Patrick, who creates more squirrels on his upkeep. Patrick then draws and plays a Force for turn before he activates Chatterfang in order to use the ability to destroy Lorn. Lorn then gets sent to the graveyard and Patrick sends Chatterfang over at Eli, who responds by exiling it with a Path to Exile. In response to that, Patrick then uses Chatterfang's ability to sacrifice the last of his squirrels to destroy the Ethereal Investigator. Patrick then gets a land from his library to put into play, and Day then becomes night. This then has his Caretaker transforming into a Hollowhinge Huntmaster, and Fog draws for turn. Fog then casts From the Catacombs, which has him bringing Barakos back into play from his graveyard and giving himself the initiative once again. He then chooses to scry 2 cards to the bottom of his library before he casts a Candy Grapple, bargaining his Sigil of Valor. He then uses the grapple to destroy Alana before going to his instep, creating himself another Fairy Dragon token. Eli then uses his library before he draws for turn and casts a Teferi's Ageless Insight. He then also casts a Brainstorm, which has him drawing 6 cards and putting 2 cards from his hand back on top of his library. Eli then casts a tapped 500-Year Diary. He then goes to combat and puts a bunch of counters on one of his spears thanks to the Eidetic Memory before he then swings all of his flyers over at Patrick and Martin. Martin then takes his damage, going down to 17 life while Patrick gets taken out of the game. He then upticks Tezzeret to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards before he then pays to cast Lona's Cryptozoologist. He then finally ends his turn untapping all of his lands while nighttime once again becomes day. Martin plays a Force for turn, creating a copy of Scoot Swarm before he then casts a Voracious Hydra where X is equal to 4. He then has his Hydra fight the Lonas, sending it to the graveyard before it goes to combat, deciding to swing his 1 creature over to Eli, taking him down to 37 life. On his instep, Fog taps his Treasure Dredger to pay a life and create a treasure token. Fog then goes to his upkeep untapping and chooses to use his dungeon in order to goad the Giant Spirit token. He then draws for turn before he then pays to equip Barakos with the multi-class Baldric. He then pays enough to cast his commander Safana a 3rd time, and in response to this, Eli casts a Broker's Charm. This then has Eli choosing to have his Giant Spirit deal damage equal to its power to Barakos, sending Barakos to the graveyard. After this, Fog then goes to his instep, creating another Fairy Dragon as well as a treasure token. On his instep, Eli pays to use his enchantment in order to exile more creatures from his graveyard, which has him gaining more life before he then untaps her turn and draws. He then decides to go to combat, which has him creating another Giant Spirit token. He then swings his 2 Giant Spirits over at Martin while he swings his other flyers over at Fog. Martin then gets taken out of the game and Fogg blocks as many of the flyers as he can, but he still loses the initiative to Eli. Fogg then goes down to 20 life and Eli goes into the second part of the Undercity, which has him scrying 2 cards to the bottom of his library. Fogg then knows he can't outlast Eli's value engine on his own, so he decides to scoop the game up to Eli. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.